This is the Mavic 3 Pro, and this is the Mavic 4 Pro. Let's go test and compare and see if the Mavic 4 Pro is worth the upgrade, or if the Mavic 3 Pro can still hold its own. As I tested and compared these two drones, I was surprised to see how little differences there were in some arenas, especially in image quality, and how much difference there was in some other areas. But before we jump into comparing all of the specs and details between these two drones, you need to know that I bought and paid for both of these. They're not given to me. This is not a sponsored video. So let's jump into image quality. And let's start with the main camera in video. Now, in video, both of these drones will film fantastic, beautiful, Hasselblad color science video, but there's a difference between them. The Mavic 4 Pro can film 6K up to 60 frames a second, where the Mavic 3 Pro can only film 5.1K up to 50 frames a second. So if you work in a 30 frames or 60 frames a second timeline, then obviously the Mavic 4 Pro is going to be better for you. But what surprised me was the subtle differences between these two. I expected there to be maybe a little bit more difference between the two, and there is. The Mavic 4 Pro definitely has a little bit better dynamic range on this main camera, and some of that is depending on what mode you're shooting in. But, and there is a little more detail because it is 6K versus 5.1K, but honestly, I was kind of surprised that there wasn't a very noticeable, substantial difference between these two. One of the big differences between the Mavic 4 and the Mavic 3 is that the Mavic 3 was somewhat limited in what resolutions and frame rates you could film in, depending on what you were using it for. So if you were using active track, it was limited to certain frame rates and resolutions. If you were using smart features, some of those were limited into frame rates and resolutions. And in my case, if you're using the Mavic Pro Cine, the 3 Pro Cine, then you also were limited to not being able to use ProRes pretty much in any of the smart active track or master shots or anything like that. So you were limited to the H.264, H.265 codec. I'm happy to say that the Mavic 4 Pro basically gets rid of all of those limitations, and you can film active track. You can do pretty much anything you want to do in every video mode, in every video codec, in all of the different frame rates and resolutions, which is really nice. Now, do you need all 6K 60 video tracking yourself around? Probably not, but it is nice to have the option to where you're not limited to certain frame rates and certain resolutions and certain codecs to be able to use some of those smart features. Both of these drones do film slow motion, 4K, 120 frames a second, and then give you a 30 frames a second file. And in slow motion modes, both of these drones suffer from the same drop in image quality when you're filming in 4K 120. Now, that's not unusual. I have the same issue with my Canon R5 II, and they both crop in a fair amount to give you that footage. The difference is, though, that the Mavic 4 Pro, because it's a 28mm camera to start out with, and the Mavic 3 Pro is a 24mm camera to start out with, that you definitely start getting a very tight field of view on the Mavic 4 Pro. And that is probably my first big disappointment in the Mavic 4, is that it didn't stick with a 24mm field of view. Up to this point, it looks like the Mavic 4 is pretty much winning all the way around. But I discovered one area where the Mavic 4 is considerably worse than the Mavic 3, and that comes in flaring. If you're somebody who likes to get sunstars or shoot towards strong bright lights, you are not going to be very happy with the Mavic 4 unless you open up the aperture. Now, the Mavic 4 does get nice sunstars at a much lower aperture than the Mavic 3 does, but if you stop the aperture down, look at what happens. You get a massive amount of sensor flare, and that is not something that I think we can get rid of. Now, I don't have ND filters, so that might help once you get ND filters on there, but as it is now, there's a considerable amount of flaring. So the way to get rid of this or minimize it is to open your aperture up to f2.8 or f2 even, and then just really have a pretty dark ND filter on there if you're shooting straight toward the sun. But side by side, the flares on the Mavic 4 and the flares on the Mavic 3, the Mavic 4s are much better defined, the sunstars are, but there are a lot more flares there, where the Mavic 3 is less defined sunstars, but also less flaring. Now on the Mavic 4 Pro, we have an f2 aperture as opposed to an f2.8 aperture, so you get almost a full stop more light, which is considerable, especially if you're going to operate in low light environments. And speaking of low light footage, here you can see side-by-side examples of the different low light modes ramping through the ISO range all the way from 100 on up to the top 12,800. But the difference between the two is that when you get to a certain point on the Mavic 3, you have to then switch out of D-Log or out of the normal color shooting profile and switch into night mode, which has severe noise reduction to be able to get you these really high ISOs, where the Mavic 4 actually just has all of that built in. And you can reduce the amount of noise reduction and then reduce noise in post if you want to. I usually run that at -2 and then reduce as I need to in post. But you can see both of these, like, they do perform well in low light, but the Mavic 4 definitely, because of that more open aperture, that extra stop of light, really shows up and shines through. Another way the Mavic 4 has improved over the Mavic 3 that I didn't really expect and nobody really has talked about is that where the Mavic 3 was pretty limited in how you could select your ISO in normal mode and in the log modes, you had very specific sets of ISO that you could select. It was pretty much limited to whole stops, and in D-Log it was even more limited than that. But the Mavic 4 has drastically improved on that, giving you much finer level of detail on the ISO you can choose. And supposedly it has a dual ISO of 400 and 1600 if you're in log mode. But just the fact alone that you can now select a lot more different levels of ISO gives you a lot more flexibility when you're composing a shot. I also wanted to test rolling shutter, and while this isn't a very scientific test and I didn't do a very good job of matching up shutter speeds, it looks like they're very similar. Like, there is rolling shutter on both. Not a huge difference between the two, but somebody had mentioned that there was worse rolling shutter in their review, and I don't see it. It's pretty close, pretty similar to me. But that's honestly only going to come into play if you're doing fast movement, tracking things from the side where you have things like light poles or straight things that you will see that slight bend in. One way the Mavic 4 differentiates itself from the Mavic 3 is how much the gimbal can tilt the camera up. Now up to 70 degrees as opposed to 40 degrees. And while that's only useful for certain kinds of shots, like this bridge that you're seeing here, it can be useful. And in a location like this, it's actually kind of a fun way to get some creative shots. So let's get this drone to the air and take a couple shots. Also, flying in a place like this drives your obstacle avoidance crazy, but the obstacle avoidance is doing a good job. And one thing that I was surprised to find on the Mavic 4 compared to the Mavic 3, and I guess I should have expected it considering it's on the Air 3S, which a comparison video between the Mavic 4 and the Air 3S will be coming, is that the Mavic 4 now has a subject tracking focus system. And I can't find any documentation on this, but as you can see here, like, it clearly puts a yellow box around a person and a face. And if you move close to the drone or farther away from the drone, it actually does change focus, which means it has some sort of continuous autofocus. Now, it's not fast, it doesn't react really snappy, but it does change from near to far focus as your subject moves closer or farther away, which is actually super cool, because having a continuous focus system on a drone like this has been an issue for a while, as you couldn't start out really tight and then pull way back without basically losing your focus. And now to talk about the much hyped and very gimmicky feeling 360 roll feature of the Mavic 4. I don't know what to say. At first when I saw it, I was like, that is the most ridiculous gimmicky thing. But I do think there are two areas where this would be useful. I worked on a show for several seasons that was a murder mystery show, and in that case, yes, I think this gimbal roll, to be able to get Dutch angles and kind of odd stuff, it actually would be useful. And the only other use case that I will say it is allowed and okay to use this 360 gimbal roll feature is when you find a pristine mirror surface mountain lake and you can flip the world upside down and then flip it right side up again. Other than that, I don't think we should really use the 360 roll feature. In fact, please use it sparingly. And of course, we need to cover vertical video because now that the Mavic 4 has this rolly gimbal thing, you can actually get true vertical video, but it comes with a massive caveat is that if you're shooting in vertical mode, you only get 10 degrees of up tilt and 10 degrees of down tilt. And I've already found those limits in like 10 or 15 mile an hour winds. So you hit those limits much faster than you think. So yes, you can get true full frame, or not full frame, but full resolution vertical video out of this, but it is limited. The caveat or the biggest upgrade to that is that you don't have to flip the gimbal into vertical mode because it's a larger sensor. You can now put it in 4K and get actual 4K vertical pre-cropped video out of the main Hasselblad camera. That's a big win if you shoot a lot of vertical video. The Mavic 3, basically you would film in 5.1K and then crop it in post if you wanted to get vertical video out of it. So for vertical video shooters, I still honestly think the Mini 4 Pro might be a little better because you get that wider angle field of view and stuff like that. The whole gimbal flips over, but the Mavic 4 Pro is definitely a step in the right direction if you have clients or if you shoot a lot of vertical video or clients that demand vertical video. Now, when it comes to the 70mm camera in video, which is the 3X on the Mavic 3 or the 2.5X on the Mavic 4, the new camera or optics on the Mavic 4, I feel like, yes, they are slightly sharper, but other than that, and maybe slightly better low light performance, I really couldn't see a huge difference. The biggest difference comes with the fact that DJI now has that somewhat weird continuous tracking autofocus feature included in this, so it actually does give you some pretty cool uses for depth of field, but it's not massively different. They look very, very similar. It does have slightly better low light. It does have slightly more dynamic range. And I guess the biggest feature for the 70mm is now you can film in up to 4K 120 slow motion versus being limited to 4K 60 on the Mavic 3. So that might be useful for you. And that brings us to the 168mm camera or the 166 on the Mavic 3. So there's a 2mm difference between the two. And on the Mavic 3, it's a 7X. On the Mavic 4, it's a 6X. It's definitely better on this new drone. On the Mavic 4, you get substantially better low light performance because you went from a 3.4 aperture on the Mavic 3 to a 2.8 aperture on the Mavic 4, which is quite a bit better. It definitely has sharper and a better optic design because it does give you sharper, better images. It also has that facial recognition, tracking, autofocus, continuous autofocus feature that the Mavic 3 or Mavic 4 has on all of its cameras. And you can now shoot up to 4K 100 frames a second as opposed to being limited to 4K 60 frames a second. And I tried to test this in a few different scenarios like wind and stuff like that, and it does seem a bit better and a bit more stable as far as that goes. It definitely tracks people better. They've improved that algorithm when you're, tracking a subject. But in most cases, there's still a pretty hard limit there. That is an extremely long focal length to have on a small drone. And in windy situations or anything like that, you're gonna see issues with it unless you're flying in pretty decent, pretty calm conditions. But one of the biggest feature upgrades that the Mavic 4 has, and honestly, I feel like most of the biggest upgrades haven't even been mentioned up to this point, is the fact that the histogram is now accurate to what you're filming, not what you're seeing. So here you can see the Mavic 3 Pro. When I turn the color assist tool on and off, the histogram changes based on whether that is on or off. So you could be filming with the color assist tool on and thinking that you're overexposed. But because you're filming in D-Log, you're not. You're actually, fine, and you can color grade that later. You're not blowing out highlights or anything like that. But the Mavic 4 fixed this issue where the histogram is accurate to what you're filming, not what you're looking at. So you can turn the color assist tool on or off and know that what you're seeing in the histogram is actually accurate to what you're filming in D-Log or D-Log M. That is incredibly great for filmmakers like me who use drones a ton. The fact that we now have a white balance tool that also includes tint. The Mavic 3 doesn't have that, and one thing that always drove me crazy about the Mavic 3 is that if you set it in auto white balance and then turn the auto white balance off, it would lock the white balance, but you could see the color tint from green to magenta shift to the neutral position again. So it could be correcting for too much green or correcting for too much magenta, but as soon as you turn the auto white balance off, it would shift to a neutral, and yeah, you have proper Kelvin values, which also the Kelvin values were always a little off as far as what you would think or what you would expect and what the Mavic 3 wanted to do, but the tint was never correct. Now in the Mavic 4, we have a proper tint tool, and when you use auto white balance to find the white balance, it's not only more accurate, but it also sets the tint, and then when you turn auto off, so essentially locking the white balance, it actually locks both the white balance and the tint. And before we jump into talking about the photos, because there's a fair amount to unpack there, we need to talk about the all-eye versus ProRes codec. I'm going to do a deep dive video on those two codecs and the differences between them, because the differences are subtle, not as much as you would think, but there are some reasons that I'm bummed that they got rid of ProRes, because ProRes is a very easy codec to work with, especially if you work on Mac. And case in point, I had to downgrade the software on my M2 Ultra Mac Studio to be able to even see the all-eye codec. So if you have an M3, M2, M1, and you can't see the footage, you probably need to downgrade from Sequoia to Sonoma, and that should be able to let you see it. I tried it on all of my Macs that have from M1 to M3, and it all was the same case, that any of them that were on Sequoia couldn't view the footage. Rolling it back to Sonoma made it possible to view the footage on any of those Macs. And that brings us to photos, of which there is a fair amount of difference between these two drones. Even though they're both using 4/3 sensors, we have the two different aspect ratios now, 4:3 on the Mavic 3 and 3:2 on the Mavic 4. So you can see the full photos side by side here. So the aspect ratio is a little different. But on the main camera, we went from a 20 megapixel still to a 25 megapixel still. Now, yes, you can use that up to 100 megapixels because it's a quad Bayer sensor. We'll jump into that in a second. But in the 20 versus 25, the new Mavic 4 Pro is significantly sharper, and there's definitely more detail there. You can see these side by side, and if we zoom in a couple 100%, like there's definitely a better quality photo on the Mavic 4 than the Mavic 3. So if you do a lot of photo work, then that is actually a pretty good size upgrade. And there is better dynamic range in the raw photos coming from the Mavic 4 than the Mavic 3. But we need to talk about the 100 megapixel photo mode, because everybody's saying it's a 100 megapixel camera. It's not. It's a 25 megapixel camera that is a quad Bayer sensor. So then DJI takes those 4 photodiodes or photosites, whatever and divides them up 4 ways and gets a little bit more detail out of those photos. Not a true 100 megapixel like if you had an actual Hasselblad camera or something like that, but it does give you a little bit more detail. Now, in my testing and looking at the photos side by side and zooming way in, like there's a little bit more detail there, but it's not night and day. The downside of doing that is that you lose a little bit of dynamic range. So personally, I love the 25 megapixel photos. They are fantastic, great dynamic range, beautiful colors, really good detail, and that's probably what I'm going to shoot with most of the time. And not only that, but the 100 megapixel stills are a fair amount more memory. So there's that if you're storing photos locally. I prefer the 25 megapixel stills. They look really great. And that brings us to the 70 millimeter camera in photo mode, which gives you 12.5 megapixel stills or 50 megapixel stills. And again, we're kind of in that same space where, like, yes, there's more detail in the 50 megapixel stills than there is in the 20 megapixel stills or the 12.5 megapixel stills. But personally, I prefer the 12.5 megapixel stills. And the same is true on the Mavic 3. You get a 12 megapixel or 48 megapixel. I stick with the 12 megapixel because you get that better dynamic range from the quad Bayer sensor, sticking with that base resolution and not the divided by 4 resolution. I think probably the biggest upgrade here that they made on the Mavic 4 over the Mavic 3 is that the optics are just a little bit better and gives you a little bit sharper image. And that brings us to the 166 or the 168 millimeter cameras. And honestly, these are very, very similar, except for that you have that tracking system in there. And yes, I think the 168 is better. It has better low light for sure because of that larger aperture, but it also has a different, better optical design that gives you slightly sharper photos and a little bit blurrier backgrounds. Other than that, like, I don't see a huge, massive difference between all of these photos. Both drones are still fantastic photo drones. It's just, yes, the Mavic 4 is a little bit better in most cases because it's also 3 years newer. But the biggest upgrade for both of these drones is the Cine version or the Creator Bundle, which gives you access to the SSD. And that lets you take a full RAW photo every 1 second interval, which is really useful for hyperlapses and photogrammetry work or mapping work when you're needing to take lots of photos as fast as possible and write them to the disk. And how this plays into hyperlapses is it just gives you more flexibility in how to create and make your hyperlapse look. Now, one thing I did find interesting is that the Mavic 3 Pro, you can go down to 1 second intervals, at least with the Cine version, and get a 1/6 something shutter speed, but the Mavic 4 Pro is limited to 1/8 at a 1 second interval. But they did get rid of the 750 shot limit in the Mavic 4 Pro compared to the Mavic 3 Pro. So you could technically go much longer with the larger battery and the more flight time, which we'll talk about more later, and get better or longer, more photos in a hyperlapse because the Mavic 4 Pro isn't limited to 750 photos max. What does all this mean? Really, it means we're going to need ND filters if you want to do a bunch of hyperlapse work because both of these drones will need like an ND 1000 to create a lot of motion blur in any situation if you're out in daylight. So Freewell is working on some. I'll link them in the description as soon as they're ready to go. In fact, I think you can start pre-ordering them now. But yeah, you're definitely going to want ND filters for both of these drones. And now that we've covered image quality, we got to talk about what I think are probably the biggest upgrades that DJI has made to the Mavic 4 Pro over the Mavic 3. Because honestly, in image quality wise, we're talking 5 to 10% better, not a night and day difference. But the biggest upgrades DJI made are actually mostly untalked about and under the hood when it comes to the Mavic 4 Pro coming from the Mavic 3. For example, the Mavic 3, I'm not sure what GPS system it's using, but it takes a while to be able to grab all the GPS satellites it needs and be able to set up. The Mavic 4 Pro has a new U-Blox-based GPS system, which is much faster and also extremely accurate. So it not only grabs more satellites faster, but it is a much more accurate GPS system, which could be useful. Like, it's basically like an RTK system, but you need the RTK base station and all of that. But the Mavic 4 Pro has a much better GPS system built in. Another somewhat big upgrade, depending on if you use it a lot, is Active Track. Now, Active Track on the Mavic 3 was good, but it, compared to the newer drones, is somewhat basic. The Active Track on the Mavic 4 has considerably improved, matching the Air 3S in most ways, but in a few ways even surpassing it. For example, when I'm kayaking, the Mavic 3 always had trouble actually locking onto me as a subject, and even the Air 3 and the Air 3S did as well. The Mavic 4 has no trouble locking onto me as a subject when I'm in my kayak. But the other improvements that come along with that are the fact that it locks onto cars much better and much farther away, and apparently now includes a bird tracking mode, which I don't even understand why, but whatever. But it also includes a lot of the new intelligent modes where the drone will just kind of do whatever it's going to do and get you a variety of different active track angles, which is super cool. And if you do use active track a lot, yes, it is much better. On waypoints, I haven't seen a huge difference. It's very much the same. Very, very good, useful waypoint features, just like on the Air 3S or on the Mavic 3. Another example of that is, of course, battery life and flight performance. The Mavic 4 Pro, in most cases, has about 10 minutes more flight time than the Mavic 3 Pro does. Now, I did do a static hover test here in the studio, and I did actually get a full 40 minutes of hovering out of the Mavic 4 Pro, which is about what DJI says you should get, which is amazing because I've never gotten that close before. I ran the battery down to 8%. I did get about 40 minutes. The Mavic 3 Pro, yeah, it was a lot less, but also my batteries are like 40 to 50 cycles in on most of them, so I can't really count that against the Mavic 3 Pro, but you definitely are getting a fair amount more flight time and hover time out of the Mavic 4 Pro. The new triple charger with the 250 watt power bank or power brick is a huge win. You can take and have these batteries discharged, which I discharged them all to 8%, plug them in, and you can see here that it actually pulled 200 up to 256 watts, I think was the max it pulled. But it fully recharged all of these batteries, all 3 of them, in about an hour and 20 minutes, which is so much faster than the sequential charger base for the Mavic 3 Pro, when you would have to charge each battery individually all the way up before it could start the next one and the next one. So huge time saver and a much faster charging system. But you do have to have that 250 watt power brick charger that comes with the creator combo, or order it separately. Otherwise, you're limited to about 100 watts through the USB-C input, which is still fast, but not nearly as fast as the new charger. One thing that separates the Mavic 4 from the Mavic 3 is the new top speed. The Mavic 4 is now capable of about 55 miles an hour, like in normal conditions, which would be what we're dealing with today. And if there's a little bit of a tailwind, you're supposed to be able to get up to 60. So let's see what we can do here. All right, we're hitting 52. Come on, baby. 53. 54. But it also has a new ascent speed of almost 22 miles an hour, 23 miles an hour almost, and a descent speed of 22.5 miles an hour. That is so terrifying. Even on the Air 3S, I have it is, having a drone drop out of the sky that fast is really scary. Speed run with the Mavic 3. Sport mode. No obstacle avoidance, thank you. Got it. And punch it. So it did get up to speed really quick, but also we're going 10 miles an hour slower than, I'm almost hitting 47 miles an hour, which is not bad. But that's slower. And then of course we're limited to about 18 miles an hour for ascent and 13.5 miles an hour for descent. So not anywhere close to as fast as the Mavic 4. And normal mode now includes obstacle avoidance all the way up to almost 40 miles an hour, which is really handy. But let's talk about obstacle avoidance, because while there are some huge upgrades here, I never encourage anybody to rely heavily on obstacle avoidance because it can fail. They still need to be able to see something that's 2 centimeters big, which is about 3/4 of an inch, and you still need good contrast to see it. But the Mavic 4 Pro has massively improved over the Mavic 3 because now you only need 0.1 lux to be able to see, or for the obstacle avoidance to see, compared to 15 lux, which is a huge difference. But the biggest win for people who fly these drones like me is that you now can actually see out the vision assist so much better and so much more detail in much higher contrast situations. Here you can see the Mavic 3 Pro, like you can't really make out any detail in the dark trees because of the sunlit, snowy covered mountains. When you use the Mavic 4 Pro, you can actually see a crap ton of detail in the trees and in the mountains. And so using the Vision Assist to be aware of what's around you, the Mavic 4 is just a much better drone. Now, I did do some obstacle avoidance testing. I didn't push it hard because I can't get a replacement in the US for this drone, and I can't get like DJI Care Refresh or anything like that because of what's going on with the US and DJI right now. But it does do really well. You can see here a tracking test where I was having it track me through the woods, and it tracked me fine. Lots of other creators have done great obstacle avoidance tests, and it seems to do very well, about as well as you would expect any drone to do. And another big upgrade that the Mavic 4 Pro has over the Mavic 3 is that DJI has now included a Lidar sensor in this front arm here. And that not only helps you detect obstacles that are in front and helps with the tracking, but that also is part of the no GPS return to home functionality that DJI has added in here, which essentially means the Lidar on the arm and then the system down here is building a 3D map. Regardless of whether or not the drone has GPS signal, it will return home because it remembers that 3D map. And so it will essentially follow the exact same flight path home that it took once it took off. So you can return, or this drone can return to home in GPS denied environments. One of the big differences I wanted to see was how fast you could turn both of these drones on. So with the Mavic 4, and just like that, we're ready to go. Let's try that with the Mavic 3. And just like that, we're ready to go on the Mavic 3 as well. I did test switching between all of the different cameras because the Mavic 3 Pro was fairly slow when it switched between cameras. And there definitely is a difference here. I wasn't sure how much until I looked at the footage side by side. And yeah, the Mavic 4 Pro switches between the 3 cameras a lot faster. But one of the biggest upgrades, if you are somebody that flies the Cine model like I do, is the fact that the Mavic 3 now not only is the SD card much easier to get to, but you don't have to turn it on to access the internal storage. You just plug it in via the cable provided and it will pop up on your desktop as your internal storage, which is a huge plus. Which is different from the Mavic 3 in that the Mavic 3 had to be on, and then you could plug it in, and then after a second it would go into a USB sleep mode, so you wouldn't be burning too much battery, but you also had to enable that, and then it would pop up and you could pull all your files off. One of the things I was surprised about was the difference between the two drones in the sound of them and how loud they are. So this is a sound test of the Mavic 4. It is 1 arm's length away. It's just a little over a meter, or about 4 feet away from the Pocket 3. Right now you're hearing the lapel, but this is what it sounds like from the Pocket 3, and I'm talking, obviously. Yeah. This is the sound test of the Mavic 3. It's the same spot, about 4 feet, a little over a meter away, and yeah, right now you're hearing the lapel, but this is what it sounds like directly from the Pocket 3. Now, depending on which combo of the Mavic 3 or the Mavic 4 Pro will depend on which remote you get. Now, if you got the non-Cine edition, you got this remote, except for it didn't have the antennas here. And if you don't get the Creator combo, you can get this remote with the Mavic 3. This remote is great. It takes a while to boot up. It's not very bright on sunny days, but I still prefer this over having to stick my phone in something. However, if you upgraded to the Cine model or the Creator combo on the Mavic 3 or 4 respectively, then you get the new RC Pro 2 versus the new or the old RC Pro. And there is a huge difference there. Not only do you now have the sticks built in, but when you do this, it turns on automatically and boots up very quick. The new screen is a lot brighter. It's up to 1600 nits sustained or 2000 nits when needed briefly, but it's a lot brighter. But I think the biggest improvement between these two remotes is the fact that when you are holding this and flying like this, your hands are no longer covering parts of the screen here, which was always a huge issue for me when I did live events Like I did the Cup of Americas for Red Bull, and having my hands over part of the screen drove me crazy. Whereas with this, your hands are not covering the screen. You can tilt it to get the right angle. The one thing that threw me off for a while is the power button on this, because when you close this, it just goes to sleep. It doesn't actually turn off. The power button is here. Another huge win is full-size HDMI versus HDMI mini. So if you do live events like I do a lot, and then of course, that makes a huge difference, but also the fact that this drone is now compatible with the Mini 4 Pro, the Air 3, the Air 3S, and the Mavic 4 is a huge win for people like me who fly a lot of different drones for a lot of different things. I only have to have this remote. And while they are about the same footprint from, top, bottom, the RC Pro 2 is definitely a little bit thicker because of the screen. However, I haven't really noticed that when putting it in my camera bag or in any of the things that I've carried this in. It feels like it fits pretty well. That being said, I can't wait to put a screen protector on this because I'm a little bit terrified of this screen cracking. And because DJI thinks about these sort of things, if you're going to film in vertical, rotating the screen, I'm sure you've seen that on people's reviews by now, allows you to go straight into vertical video mode. I didn't think it would be as big or as noticeable, the difference as it is, but it is noticeable. The Mavic 3 is definitely quite a bit larger and quite a bit heavier than the Mavic, or the Mavic 4 is quite a bit larger and heavier than the Mavic 3 is. It definitely takes up more space in your bag. It is noticeably bigger and heavier. So that might play into whether or not you want to upgrade or not. So where does that leave us? The Mavic 4 is in most ways a very big improvement over the Mavic 3. Not in all the ways I expected. I think the image quality is much closer than most people think it is, especially once it's compressed on YouTube. Like, I don't know if you'll even be able to see most of the differences between these two drones. But to me, most of the improvements didn't come through image quality. They came through the user quality of life improvements of how fast it sets up, how fast it locks on a GPS, the different things like I talked about with the white balance. Those things are huge for professional users and make a really big difference in quality of life when you use these drones multiple times on a daily basis. And most of those make the Mavic 4 a worthy upgrade over the Mavic 3. But the reality is that the image coming out of the Mavic 3 is still amazing. It's still incredible. It gives you incredibly great footage, beautiful shots. And so if image quality is your main concern, I would say you don't really have to upgrade to the Mavic 4, unless of course you want to buy them through my affiliate links down below, which you absolutely can and maybe should then. But in reality, like, either one of these drones is going to give you incredible image quality. But let me know what you think in the comments below, and especially let me know if you'd like to see an Inspire 3 comparing to the Mavic 4 Pro, because we're getting closer. But next you're going to watch this video right here. I'll see you over there. As always, if you have questions, let me know in the comments below, or you can join my live stream, which happens most Wednesday nights at 4 p.m. Alaska time, 8 p.m. Eastern, where we can have more of a conversation and I can answer questions that maybe I didn't get to in this video. I'll see you guys soon in the next one. Cheers.